Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about Logical Contemporary Rhetoric's chapter on language. Admittedly, part of its approach is somewhat different than some other critical thinking textbooks. And here's the way in which it's different. It doesn't use quite as much technical language. In other words, it does a lot of paring down to the main ideas, so you don't get mired down in memorizing a lot of definitions. Now, understanding the technical definitions of things can be useful, but unfortunately, sometimes you get so mired in the technical terms and definitions that you end up, missing the main idea. And that's one thing I like about this textbook's approach. Now, the conversation about language is crucial to critical thinking. Because recall, not all of the bad thinking that we are doing might have to do with logical fallacies. The fact is, language itself can sometimes be deceptive. For example, if we choose to use certain words to describe something, that will affect our listeners or readers differently than if we use some other word. So if we are trying to persuade people to a particular point of view, the language that we use matters very much. In fact, using certain words might have certain connotations that other words do not. And this is kind of where the author leads off the chapter, talking about the distinction between cognitive meaning versus emotive meaning. Now, when the author is talking about cognitive meaning here, he is talking about words that predominantly have more objective sounding dictionary type definitions. Now, some textbooks, when talking about this, use the technical language, and they're talking about things having a lexical meaning. And by the way, when we talk about lexical meaning, we're talking about our language lexicon. In other words, something like a dictionary definition. Now, persuaders, in other words, people trying to persuade us of something, recognize that certain words have emotive meanings as well as cognitive meanings. And in some cases, there are words that actually have emotive meanings that actually outweigh the cognitive meanings. And the kind of examples that the author of the text points out are ones that have to do with things like our religion and our politics. In other words, things that we are emotionally tied to and connected to. And if you're emotionally tied to something, they can be used against you to lead you to believe things that might be untrue, or you might be better off not believing it. Now, one of the words the author brings up is our good friend freedom. Just about everybody has positive connotations when it comes to this word freedom, even though it has a variety of meanings in a variety of contexts. So if you portray someone as trying to take away a particular freedom, that person will automatically be the bad guy, regardless of what that freedom happens to be. Many people only have a vague idea of what democracy really means. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of different kinds of democracies. The thing is, if you grow up in a society like ours, you tend to have a positive view of democracy automatically. So this is a word that has, generally speaking, positive emotive meanings. Now, of course, here's some other words that have to do with politics that in the US of A have very negative emotive meanings. Socialism. When many people hear the word socialism, they automatically think of Soviet gulags, Soviet prison camp. Now keep in mind, many of these isms that we have been taught to connect to one another in our minds are not conceptually equivalent. But because their emotive meanings override their cognitive meanings, we equate things with one another. So it's sort of no wonder that if someone calls something creeping socialism, they automatically get these pictures in their mind of prison camps in the former Soviet Union. Even though the kinds of things and policies that are frequently labeled socialist are typically fairly diverse, and some of them, when people actually hear them described to them without words with emotive meaning, many people actually think the policies sound kind of good, oddly enough. And I'll go for low-hanging fruit if you don't mind. When you portray healthcare reform as socialized medicine, large numbers of people will automatically be against it, no matter what the details are. However, if you call it something like universal healthcare or single-payer healthcare, which takes out the word with the emotive meaning, even though we're talking about the very same generalized policies, people are likely to have a different point of view about it. And by the way, various research groups that poll about what people's opinions are about particular policies have noted that when certain language is used that involves emotive meanings, people are oftentimes, by and large, against something. However, when it's framed in different conceptual language, people will often poll in favor of something. This is, I was just trying to sum up here why emotive language matters so much. And you'll see later on in the chapter, the author of the text speaks of language framing, or what's sometimes called linguistic framing. Now, when we're talking about linguistic framing, we are also talking about what can fairly be called conceptual framing. The language that we end up using constructs the framework in which people are likely to see something. So if you frame something as socialized medicine, it sounds very different than framing it as something like universal healthcare. So people will literally see it differently, even though we're talking about the very same thing. Now, if you're trying to persuade someone to be for something, you're more likely to use the kind of language that will, perhaps have positive connotations or neutral connotations. If you're trying to get someone against something, you will be more likely to use very negative sounding language that is likely to resonate with your audience. Now this is going to be one of the main things in the chapter to get down. Next. The author introduces us to the concept of euphemistic language. Now please get this down properly. Euphemistic language refers to words or phrases that have either more neutral or positive tone to them. You take something that has a generally negative connotation associated with it, and you replace it with language that is more neutral or positive. Now, the author talks about euphemistic language that most of us probably don't think is very problematic. To replace words or phrases that might be offensive and unnecessarily offensive with words or phrases that are more delicate sounding. Think of the number of euphemisms that exist for going to the can. Oh, that was kind of a euphemism itself. To relieve yourself. You don't have to say, hey man, I'm going to defecate. By the way, defecate, of course, sounds better than taking fill in whatever word you want to use for it. Yeah, I'm going to use the restroom. Dude, I'm not taking a rest. I'm not taking a nap. There's not a bed in there. But nonetheless, we call it a restroom. Now, most of us don't think these euphemisms are a problem. It is just being polite. Now, notice in less polite times, and this kind of harkens back to an earlier discussion, keep in mind that negative language associated with marginalized peoples used to be totally accepted by the dominant culture. Now, you'll notice that we have gotten rid of those words that were indeed offensive words, and we have replaced them with nicer words. Now, this is sometimes associated with so-called political correctness that will be discussed near the end of this chapter as a sort of culminating issue. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is we use one more example before I leave it. Think of the number of euphemisms that are used associated with sex and human sexuality, or with body parts. Now, some of us do think that some of these euphemisms might have some negative ramifications. Because when we teach our children to use silly little euphemistic words, they might not take life quite so seriously. Or they might even develop what? Shame. If we were to talk about things more honestly and openly, now I'm presupposing that there's some ways that are more honest and open in just saying that, perhaps we would grow up to have less hang-ups if we would actually call things by their clinical name rather than I'm doing poopies. I hope that was entertaining for some of you there. Yeah, I'm going to go do poopies. Yeah, maybe it is okay with little kids, but the problem is we turn a lot of things that shouldn't be considered shameful end up being turned into shameful things. So even my examples of non-pernicious euphemisms might end up having some kind of pernicious ends that I wasn't originally talking about. Now, I want you to know this word, even though it is not in this textbook. Dysphemism. This is a word that is highlighted in Moore and Parker's, in many editions, book Critical Thinking. A dysphemism is a little bit like a euphemism in reverse. Remember, the euphemism takes a word that has decidedly offensive or negative connotations and replaces it with a word or phrase that has a more neutral or positive tone to it. When we dysphemize something or use a dysphemism, we take something that was either could be conveyed positively or neutrally, and we replace it with a word or phrase that we think will have decidedly negative connotations. Now, why might I want to go and do that? Well, if I'm trying to take something that people don't necessarily know much about, or that they might have a positive view of it if they heard more neutral language about it, if I take some negative language and import it, I might be able to win them over to my side to hate it. Now, you'll notice dysphemic language is used in politics all of the time in order to linguistically demonize the enemy. In order to linguistically demonize the enemy. And the text even has a list of euphemisms and dysphemisms, even though the author doesn't use that word, that counts as what we might call Democratic Party speak and Republican Party speak. You will notice that the major political parties tend to use loaded language in order to shape the way an audience thinks. And once you start to think about things in a particular conceptual framework, it is not easy psychologically to get out of those conceptual frameworks, because your understanding of what those things are kind of becomes embedded into the very language that you think about the world through. Now, you might ask, why does all this matter? Why is this fodder for critical thinking? Now, I'm going to go into a little more detail than the text here. But in the early to mid part of the 20th century, there was a linguistic hypothesis called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Some of you have perhaps heard of it. The bottom line of it is that the words that we have or don't have in our language helps to shape the kind of things that we are likely to be able to conceptualize. The low-hanging fruit example there is that Inuit peoples have many more words for snow than non-Inuit languages do. And there's a good reason for it. If you are surrounded by snow most of the time, making precise differences between different kinds of snow might matter very much. Thus, there are more words for it. I'll give you another example. Some people have noted that the Greek language, Western philosophy all began with the Greeks, has a much richer philosophical language already embedded into it, which makes it possible to make more distinctions that another language may not. In the English language, we don't have that many words for love. We have this word love that many different concepts fall into that pot, whereas the Greeks have a variety of different words for love to designate the different kinds of love with more precision. Now, if you don't have particular words in your language framework, you might not be able to conceptualize things. As a matter of fact, you might not be able to see these distinctions, because our language does in fact frame the way we're likely to view reality. This is why it matters. Now, I don't want to get all philosophically in a mire here, but this kind of begs the question, what is reality? Well, some of us who are old-fashioned, and I'll admit I'm old-fashioned, I'm not fully postmodern, to use that phrase. I happen to believe that within a linguistic framework, there are more accurate ways to describe a particular state of affairs. In other words, I think that if we want to convey things in an accurate way, we should try to be as objective as possible. Now, notice that objectivity already kind of presupposes that there is a real way that things are, and that there are more accurate and less accurate ways of portraying them. Now, there are some people, and by the way, this might be for political reasons that they say this. They say, well, isn't reality just the way that you happen to see it? Now, there's a convenient reason for somebody to say something like that. They may want to avoid talking about whether or not something is actually true or something is actually false, especially when your political rhetoric is larded with falsehoods. You might like to use that as a rationalization. Hey man, what is truth? Isn't truth just a matter of perception? Well, folks, I'm a little old school about this. I don't think that truth is just a matter of perception. Now, admittedly, there might be more than one way to describe this peculiar thing that we call reality. And indeed, the ways that we describe said reality will frame the way that people are likely to see that reality. And this is why understanding language and the kind of language used matters very much. So you can critically look at the language framing being used and ask, is somebody trying to get me to think in a particular way that might not be in my interest to think? Might somebody be trying to sell me a bad bill of sale by linguistically trying to make something sound like a good thing when it's actually a bad thing? Now, keep in mind, I've already talked about this, but it's not always just the language you use. It's what you bring into the conversation, and that can be the language, but also what is conveniently left out of the conversation might end up being important too. As a matter of fact, what is conveniently downplayed might actually be the most important thing for you to have a better understanding of things. So if I'm trying to sell you an idea that might not be entirely accurate, I might try to find words that upplay certain features, and I also might try to find words that downplay certain features of something. Anyway, next. Hope we're clear about that. Now, the author of our textbook does nicely talk about our good friend. A brief bit on George Orwell is in the textbook. By the way, his real name was Eric Blair. That's not on the text, not going to be on the test. His pen name was George Orwell. He wrote under that name. He is best known as George Orwell. I have read almost all of his stuff. I like his writing, and I will admit, I'll go on record saying this because a little bit of honesty is good. I tend to agree with a lot of his political leanings. I did before I started reading him. I tended to go along with a lot of his political leanings. But anyway, the author of the text makes specific reference to his short work, Politics and the English Language. It is a funny piece, folks, sardonically funny. But part of what he addresses in this is exactly what we're talking about. The fact that certain language can be used in our political discourse that can completely cover up a vile reality. And by the way, one of the ones he talks about has to do with warfare. And our text also talks about warfare-related euphemisms. If we're going to carpet bomb a village, bomb it back to the Stone Age, to use that Vietnam era phrase, we might call it servicing a soft target. Bombing them back to the Stone Age versus servicing a soft target. Now you'll notice servicing is a very neutral sounding word. It is a word that has sometimes been euphemistically used for deploying ordnance. Deploying ordnance? What the hell is that? Dropping bombs! Ordnance is a generalized word for your payload. You can also use the word ordnance to talk about, bullets for your AR-15. Ordnance is a fairly neutral sounding word, and it covers what? It covers a wide range of weaponry that can be deployed. Deployed sounds nicer than dropping bombs. Now, the point that Orwell is trying to make here is that a public that doesn't know very much can be given a newsreel that will convey something very violent in a very neutralized way. So it doesn't seem like anybody's getting killed. Now, a couple of other examples. You'll notice that civilian deaths are frequently not talked about in wartime. Instead of calling them civilians, we would call them non-combatants. When you call them non-combatants versus combatants, it sounds a lot more neutral. And it's something you probably don't have to explain the way you would have to explain, oh yeah, we killed some civilians in the process. So this is why we don't talk much about civilian casualties. We talk about the number of non-combatants who were killed. And guess what? I happen to believe that most people are not mean and ill-willed. And perhaps I'm naive about this. But the fact is, most Americans have to be told that we are a global force for good. Whether we are or not, I'm not going to discuss. And most of our wartime activities in the 20th century have been framed as humanitarian interventions. Why have most of them been framed as humanitarian interventions? Because most people, even if they are not truly do-gooders, in their minds, most people are do-gooders who do not want to, intentionally do harm on innocent people. So in other words, you have to frame activities as if they are being done for the good of other people, whether they are or they are not. This is why we don't invade, we intervene. You get the distinction. Because when we talk about intervening, the connotation is we're coming in to do good and to fix things. To invade sounds like we're coming in uninvited to smash some things up. This is why words like intervention, tend to be preferred. Now, folks, I'm going to get outside of the sphere of America or English language when it comes to things like this. And I'm going to go for what we will call Orwellian language. And by the way, when we call something Orwellian language, the text doesn't do a very good job of defining this. We are talking about what is sometimes called Orwellian doublespeak. Doublespeak typically refers to calling something not what it objectively is, but finding words that actually convey the opposite of what the thing really is. By calling something the opposite of what it really is, it ends up framing something that people would find to be very awful into something that sounds very good. Now, I will give you some examples of Orwellian doublespeak, and guess where they show up? His well-known novel, 1984. It's an easy read. Everybody should read it at some point. Now, in 1984, we are presented with a dystopian society. In other words, a very, very bad society. George Orwell's cautionary tale of what might be, a scary future world. Now, some of us think that we've already passed the world of 1984, even though I don't have a suit that's half bad. In other words, I'm not using 2-month-old razors to shave my face like in Orwell's 1984. I'm not scrounging for enough moldy bread to eat. In other words, there is still plenty to eat at this point, but in many ways, we have already surpassed Orwell's world of 1984. We have surpassed it linguistically. In other words, there's plenty of doublespeak in our language that people don't recognize for doublespeak. Think about that after I give you a couple of examples from 1984. Winston Smith, the protagonist of the novel, works in the Ministry of Truth. In more honest times, the Ministry of Truth would be called the Ministry of Propaganda. The Ministry of Truth's job is to make sure that the news stories are consistent with the party line. And there's a part in the movie, or not the movie, it's in the movie version too. There's a part in the book where Winston Smith is starting to become awakened. And he discovers that he is being asked to write stories that directly contradict stories about the past that he has written. So he starts to ask questions, and eventually O'Brien shows up. And he takes the old news clipping that he allegedly is writing stories that are inconsistent with what he's being asked to write now. He opens a hole in the wall, puts it in, and he says it didn't happen. Now that hole in the wall is the memory hole. Have you heard that phrase, down the memory hole? Now, at the bottom of this memory hole is a fire. In other words, he is burning up the past. It didn't happen. Now go get to work. If you've ever heard that Orwellian phrase about he who controls the past controls the present. He who controls the present controls the future. If you can annihilate what actually happened in the past and convince the people of a very different narrative, you will get them to hold your point of view. And this is why some of us are so sad that the way that we're taught about history is so poorly done. Because effectively, if young people don't learn our recent history, it's no wonder they have difficulty understanding how we got here and what's going on right now. So if we conveniently don't talk about the past in honest, objective terms, it's no wonder young people are kind of unprepared to make political decisions or voting decisions. As a matter of fact, many people of my generation are not. Why? Well, because a lot of people don't have a whole lot of real knowledge about the 20th century. Yeah, you have memorized bullet points. But the more important thing is the broader context that it all unfolded in. And that's the kind of knowledge that's not always easy to have. And if you have that kind of knowledge, you end up, cynical like me, but slightly hopeful. Now, I got to get cut to the chase here. There's so many more things I could mention, but I just love the Ministry of Love. The Ministry of Love is where Winston Smith, and I hope I'm not giving away too many spoilers if you haven't read it and want to read it. But the Ministry of Love is where Winston Smith ends up. It's where they torture you until you give up, until they get you to say, I love Big Brother. I love Big Brother. And the thing is, the security state knows more about you than you do because they have been following you. They know Winston Smith's deepest, darkest fear, and they use it against him at the Ministry of Love. The Ministry of Torture is called the Ministry of Love. Now, Orwell didn't get this from nowhere. Because every time people are doing cruel and unusual things, they use euphemisms. And I have to tell you this. You do know that the Nazis had something called this. What they euphemistically called joy divisions. The joy divisions were the places where Jewish women were forced to serve as Nazi soldiers. Joy divisions. not places where captive women were abused. They called them joy divisions. And this is where the iconic band took its name. It sardonically took this name, joy divisions. Yeah, and by the way, this is sort of probably a good place to end this part of our lecture. But keep this in mind. When we euphemize things, we might not be just doing it to try to convince other people of things. Euphemisms might also be things that we tell ourselves. In other words, psychologically, we may have a need to cover up our own misdoings. So effectively, we end up are still able to tell ourselves that we're decent people and we're not monsters. Because believe this, even monsters want to believe that they're decent people.